Did you know that just 70 years ago, South Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world? After the Korean War in the 1950s, the nation was destroyed. Millions of people lived in extreme poverty, industries were gone, and the future looked hopeless. But today, South Korea is one of the richest, most advanced, and most innovative countries on the planet. From Samsung and Hyundai to K-pop and high-speed internet, Korea has become a global powerhouse. So how did this country go from war-torn poverty to one of the leading economies in less than one lifetime? This is the shocking story of South Korea's economic miracle. Make sure to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories of countries and cultures around the world. In the early 1950s, South Korea faced one of the darkest moments in its history. The Korean War, which lasted from 1950 to 1953, devastated the country. Cities were reduced to rubble, farmland was destroyed, and millions of families were separated. The war not only divided the Korean peninsula, but also left the southern half of the country in extreme poverty. At that time, South Korea was one of the poorest nations on Earth. In fact, in the mid-1950s, the country's GDP per capita was comparable to that of some of the least developed African nations. Most people lived in rural areas, relying on basic farming to survive. There was little to no industry, almost no infrastructure, and widespread hunger was a part of everyday life. The capital city, Seoul, had been bombed repeatedly during the war and was left in ruins. Bridges, roads, and railways were destroyed. The population suffered from malnutrition, unemployment, and a complete lack of opportunities. Foreign observers often looked at South Korea and predicted that the nation had no chance of recovery. Some experts even suggested that South Korea might permanently depend on foreign aid to simply survive. Indeed, in the 1950s, South Korea relied heavily on international support, especially from the United States and other allied nations. Aid programs provided food, basic supplies, and limited funds for rebuilding, but these resources were not enough to transform the country. Many South Koreans lived in makeshift shelters, and poverty was so severe that people had to line up for rations of rice and corn. Daily life was about survival rather than progress. Despite the grim reality, there was something powerful growing among the people: determination. Even in those dark times, South Koreans placed enormous importance on education. Families that had very little still tried to send their children to school, believing that knowledge could change their future. This national focus on education would later become one of the key foundations of Korea's rise. The government at that time faced an almost impossible challenge. Leaders needed to rebuild a nation from scratch with limited resources, no natural wealth, and a divided land. South Korea had almost no oil, little fertile land, and very few minerals compared to other developing countries. But what the nation lacked in resources, it made up for in resilience. During the late 1950s, schools were rebuilt, and universities began to reopen. Although the facilities were basic and sometimes overcrowded, they represented hope. Parents encouraged their children to study hard, not just for themselves, but for the future of the nation. Education was seen as the only way out of poverty. By the end of the 1950s, South Korea was still desperately poor, but the seeds of transformation were being planted. The people's discipline, cultural unity, and hunger for progress created a silent strength. While the world saw Korea as a hopeless case, the nation itself was slowly preparing for an extraordinary turnaround. This period set the stage for what would later be called the Miracle on the Han River. Without understanding the depth of Korea's struggles in the 1950s, it is impossible to fully appreciate the scale of the success story that followed. What seemed like a nation on the brink of collapse would, within a single generation, become one of the most astonishing economic success stories in modern history. By the early 1960s, South Korea was still one of the poorest countries in the world. But something remarkable was happening beneath the surface. The nation was beginning to prioritize education and discipline over short-term survival. Families with very little income still managed to send their children to school, believing that knowledge was the only path out of poverty. This collective choice, made by millions of families, created a foundation for the country's eventual rise. Classrooms were often overcrowded and poorly equipped. In rural areas, students studied in small buildings with broken windows, no heating, and limited supplies. Teachers worked for very low pay, and sometimes taught dozens of students in a single room. Yet, despite these hardships, literacy rates improved year after year. South Korea was slowly transforming into a nation where almost every child could read and write, at a time when many developing countries were still struggling with mass illiteracy. Education was not just about knowledge, it was about hope. Parents encouraged their children to work hard, not simply for personal success, but for the future of the entire nation. This cultural belief in collective progress gave South Korea a powerful tool: human capital. Even though the country lacked natural resources like oil, gold, or fertile land, it invested in its people's minds, and this became the greatest resource of all. At the same time, the government was beginning to take bold steps toward recovery. In the early 1960s, South Korea launched the first 5-year economic development plans. These plans focused on rebuilding infrastructure, creating new industries, and preparing the nation for export-driven growth. President Park Chung-hee, who came to power during this time, was determined to industrialize the country and reduce its dependence on foreign aid. His vision was that South Korea must compete in the global economy, not just survive on donations. The government directed funds toward industries that could grow quickly, such as textiles and light manufacturing. Roads, bridges, and ports were rebuilt to support trade. Electricity networks expanded, allowing factories and homes to connect to a more modern economy. For the first time since the war, South Korea was moving beyond survival and looking ahead to real progress. This period also marked the beginning of partnerships with foreign nations. The United States continued to provide financial support, but South Korea also rebuilt ties with Japan, which opened new opportunities for trade and technology transfer. These partnerships gave Korea access to machinery, investment, and training that helped local industries grow. Although controversial at the time, these international relationships accelerated the country's development. By the mid-1960s, South Korea was still poor, but it was no longer standing still. The country had found its direction. Schools were full, factories were beginning to hum, and the government had a clear strategy for growth. The transformation was still in its early stages, but the spirit of resilience and sacrifice was visible across society. South Koreans worked long hours, often in tough conditions, because they believed in a better future for the next generation. The world started to notice. Observers who had once dismissed South Korea as a hopeless case began to see signs of life. They saw a nation building itself step by step, with determination and vision. No one could have predicted the scale of success that was coming, but by the end of the 1960s, the foundations of a miracle had been laid. By the late 1960s, South Korea was no longer just surviving, it was preparing for takeoff. The investment in education had produced a new generation of disciplined, skilled, and ambitious young workers. The government's 5-year plans had created infrastructure and industries that were ready to expand. And most importantly, the people had developed a collective belief that their sacrifices today would create prosperity tomorrow. This national mindset became one of Korea's strongest advantages. While wages were low and working conditions were harsh, South Koreans accepted the struggle as a necessary step toward progress. Families endured hardship, students studied relentlessly, and workers pushed through long shifts in factories, all with one common goal: to build a stronger future. By the end of the 1960s, the stage was set for what the world would soon call the miracle on the Han River. The following decades would see South Korea achieve one of the fastest economic transformations in modern history. What had once been a war-torn nation of poverty and despair was about to become an industrial powerhouse, ready to shock the world with its rise. In the early 1970s, South Korea began the most important phase of its transformation: rapid industrialization. This period is often described as the official beginning of the miracle on the Han River. The government, under President Park Chung-hee, realized that survival alone was not enough. South Korea needed to build a strong economy that could compete internationally. The strategy was clear: industrialize quickly, focus on exports, and use every possible resource to grow. The government launched ambitious 5-year economic development plans that prioritized heavy industries such as steel, shipbuilding, and chemicals. These industries were chosen because they could generate jobs, support infrastructure, and produce goods for export. Korea had no natural oil or gold, but it could use its disciplined workforce to manufacture products for the global market. The vision was to turn South Korea into an export-driven economy, and every policy was designed to achieve that. One of the most important steps was the creation of large industrial complexes. Cities like Ulsan and Pohang were transformed into manufacturing hubs. In Pohang, the government built POSCO, which would become one of the world's largest steel companies. In Ulsan, Hyundai established shipyards that would later make South Korea the #1 shipbuilding nation on Earth. These industries not only created jobs but also symbolized Korea's determination to rise. At the same time, smaller companies were encouraged to grow, many of which would later become global giants. Samsung, LG, and Hyundai all started as modest businesses but expanded rapidly during this era. Samsung moved into electronics, LG began producing appliances, and Hyundai became famous for both cars and ships. These companies, known as chaebols in Korea, received government support in the form of loans, tax breaks, and favorable policies. In return, they fueled rapid industrial growth and gave Korea a competitive edge. The workforce played a central role in this transformation. South Koreans worked some of the longest hours in the world, often under difficult conditions, but they did so with remarkable discipline and dedication. Strikes were limited, productivity increased, and the sense of national duty was powerful. Many workers accepted low wages in exchange for the hope of building a better future. The combination of hard work and collective sacrifice gave South Korea an advantage over competitors. Exports became the lifeline of the Korean economy. Instead of producing only for domestic use, factories in South Korea manufactured goods for the world. Textiles, shoes, steel, and ships were exported in massive quantities. By the late 1970s, South Korea had moved from a struggling agricultural economy to a rapidly industrializing nation. Its products were reaching markets in the United States, Europe, and Asia, and the world began to take notice. The results were dramatic. The economy grew at rates exceeding 8% per year, one of the fastest in the world at the time. Poverty rates dropped significantly, and living standards slowly improved. Cities expanded, roads and highways were built, and modern housing replaced many of the old shelters. South Korea was no longer a country defined by despair. It was becoming a model of what rapid industrial growth could achieve. But the rise was not without sacrifice. Workers endured long shifts and environmental problems grew in industrial areas. Inequality increased as chaebols grew powerful. Yet for most South Koreans, the sacrifices felt worthwhile. The country was finally standing on its own, moving from one of the poorest nations in the world to a rising industrial power. The world was beginning to recognize Korea's transformation, but the real story had only just begun. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, South Korea had firmly established itself as an industrial nation. The miracle on the Han River was no longer just a dream, it was a reality. Factories were operating at full speed, exports were growing rapidly, and Korean products were competing in global markets. The once poor nation was now known for steel, ships, cars, and electronics. The success of companies like Samsung, Hyundai, and LG gave Korea international recognition. These firms were not only symbols of progress, but also engines of growth that created jobs and lifted millions out of poverty. Korea's reliance on exports proved to be a brilliant strategy. Instead of remaining trapped in a cycle of aid and dependency, the country had built a powerful, self-sustaining economy. Of course, the journey was not easy. Workers faced long hours, limited rights, and difficult conditions. But the collective spirit of sacrifice allowed South Korea to move forward. Every challenge was seen as part of the price to pay for national progress. And that progress was undeniable. By the early 1980s, South Korea had completed one of the fastest and most impressive industrial transformations in history. The nation that once struggled to survive after war was now standing tall as a manufacturing powerhouse. This achievement prepared South Korea for the next chapter in its story, the leap into technology, innovation, and global cultural influence. By the 1990s, South Korea had already proven to the world that it could transform from poverty to industrial success. But the country was not satisfied with just building ships, cars, and steel. The next step in Korea's journey was to become a leader in advanced technology. This bold move would not only strengthen the economy, but also redefine South Korea's place on the global stage. The Korean government invested heavily in research and development, encouraging industries to focus on electronics, semiconductors, and information technology. The chaebols, or family-owned conglomerates, once again played a central role. Samsung, which had started as a small trading company, became a global giant in electronics. By the late 1990s, Samsung was producing televisions, computers, and most importantly, semiconductors, which became one of the cornerstones of Korea's economic growth. Today, Samsung is the world's largest producer of memory chips, making South Korea a critical player in global technology supply chains. LG also grew rapidly, becoming a household name in consumer electronics and appliances. Hyundai and Kia not only built cars for domestic use, but also exported millions of vehicles worldwide. These companies helped South Korea move from being seen as a low-cost manufacturer to a nation associated with quality, innovation, and cutting-edge design. At the same time, South Korea revolutionized its digital infrastructure. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, the government made high-speed internet widely available across the country. This decision gave Korea one of the fastest internet networks in the world, long before many developed countries had similar access. As a result, South Korea became a leader in digital connectivity, esports, and online gaming culture. Education once again played a crucial role in this phase of development. South Korean students consistently ranked among the highest in mathematics, science, and reading in international studies. The country's emphasis on hard work and academic achievement produced a highly skilled workforce ready to drive the technology revolution. Engineers, scientists, and innovators powered Korea's transition into the digital era. Despite facing financial crises in the late 1990s, South Korea's resilience allowed it to recover quickly. During the Asian financial crisis of 1997, the Korean economy nearly collapsed, but the people once again demonstrated unity and sacrifice. Citizens even donated personal gold jewelry to help stabilize the nation's finances. Within a few years, South Korea emerged stronger than ever, with its industries modernized and global competitiveness restored. By the early 2000s, South Korea had firmly established itself as a global technology leader. Its smartphones, electronics, and automobiles were found in homes across the world. The country was no longer just an industrial powerhouse. It was now at the forefront of innovation, shaping the future of global technology. This transformation laid the foundation for the next surprising development, South Korea's cultural rise, which would make it a soft power giant. While technology gave South Korea economic strength, culture gave it global influence. Starting in the late 1990s and exploding in the 2000s, South Korea became a cultural powerhouse. K-pop music, Korean dramas, and movies began reaching audiences far beyond Asia. What was once a small, local entertainment industry suddenly became a worldwide phenomenon. Groups like BTS and Blackpink filled stadiums around the globe, breaking records and winning fans in every continent. Korean dramas such as Winter Sonata and later hits like Squid Game captivated international audiences, proving that storytelling from Korea could compete with Hollywood. The Oscar-winning movie Parasite made history, highlighting Korea's ability to create art that resonates globally. This cultural wave, often called the Korean Wave or Hallyu, transformed Korea's image abroad. The country was no longer known only for technology and cars, but also for creativity, style, and entertainment. The combination of economic power and cultural influence made South Korea one of the most dynamic nations in the 21st century. Today, South Korea is recognized not only for its economic miracle, but also for shaping global culture. From smartphones in your hand to the music you stream, Korea's impact is everywhere. The journey from war-torn poverty to cultural and technological leadership is one of the most inspiring success stories in modern history.